just to underline, I think what your research shows, having previously had a common cold, you have T cells which then respond to your advantage if you are exposed to COVID-19 at close quarters. So if you live, for example, with somebody with COVID-19, you think that this might go some way to explain why some people who live with people with COVID do get infected and others don't. Tell us what this means to you, Professor.
Good morning, Anna, and thank you. That's a great summary. Indeed, we set out to find what it is that protects some people heavily exposed to COVID who, despite the exposure, still don't get infected. We all know of such cases. In fact, they're quite common. About 50% of people in households where there's a COVID case, PCR positive confirmed case, about a half of the contacts don't get infected. So we set out to discover what the mechanism of that natural protective immunity is. And it turns out that in a proportion of these exposed but uninfected contacts, they harbor high frequencies of memory T cells that have been induced by previous common cold coronavirus infections. And these T cells linger for some years after those infections. And then when the body encounters SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID, these T cells are able to cross-recognize proteins in SARS-CoV-2 and then protect us from infection. In contrast, the household contacts who got infected, none of them had these T cells. You asked about how this feeds into development of vaccines, and really this is the key message here. That firstly, the key message is not that if you have a common cold, you're going to be protected against flu and against COVID and not succumb to it. That is not the message. Everyone still needs to get vaccinated, 2 vaccines plus the booster. But what this finding means is that we can actually harness this mechanism of natural protection to develop more broadly protective vaccines that would help to protect us against current and future variants. And I'm happy to tell you how that would work if that would be of interest.
Good morning, Professor Lalvani. This is exceptionally interesting. I've got 2 kind of follow-up questions. One is the T cell protection that you get from the common cold. Does that matter which variant of COVID-19 it is dealing with? And second of all, do you get the same T cell protection from the seasonal flu against COVID, or is that entirely separate?
So those are 2 great questions. And the answer to the second one is no, the seasonal flu immunity wouldn't protect you against COVID. And even the common cold immunity, only less than 20% of common colds are caused by coronavirus family infections. The rest are caused by other types of viruses. So only certain types of common colds, about 1/5 of them, induce these T cells. And these T cells would protect against variants, and here's why. The T cells that were cross-reactive, they recognize proteins in the core of the virus, internal proteins. And unlike the spike protein on the surface, which is rapidly mutating away from the antibody immunity and leading to development of Omicron, for example, that has more than 30 new mutations in spike protein, so it circumvents the antibody response. Unlike the spike protein on the surface, these internal proteins that are attacked by the T cells are very unchangeable. So they're very conserved or consistent between the seasonal coronaviruses, SARS-CoV-2, and the answer to your question, also COVID variants. So if the T cells can cross-recognize viruses as different as the distant cousin, which is the common cold coronavirus, and SARS-CoV-2, they can certainly recognize the minimal or no differences in the internal proteins between SARS-CoV-2 and its variants, whether Alpha, Delta, Omicron, or the next one.
Professor, where does that take us then in the development of vaccines? Does this take us closer to a vaccine that will work against all variants?
It absolutely does. And that's a vaccine that we call a universal vaccine. And, back in 2020, when the world focused on the spike protein and antibody immunity to that, it was the right thing to do. And the first generation of vaccines gave us a decisive victory in that battle. But what we're in with Omicron is more like a long-term military campaign. It's not about just winning the first battle. And what a universal vaccine would do is it would give a sort of immunity that would be variant proof, because the T cells would recognize current and future variants. The other benefit of T cell immunity is that it lasts longer than antibody immunity. It tends to last a few years, whereas antibody immunity, as we've seen, begins to wane within a few months of vaccination.
One thing I want to follow up on that universal vaccine, if we discover or manage to establish some kind of universal vaccine, I understand that it would take much, much longer to get approval because, of course, many of the vaccines against COVID-19 have been given emergency approval and been accelerated, whereas a universal vaccine might have much more concerns about the side effects and therefore might take many years to get approval. Is that a correct understanding of the situation?
I think the emergency approval speed might be less for a universal vaccine, but not because of safety issues. And I also think that in terms of re-engineering vaccines to include internal proteins, especially with the mRNA vaccines, that's not too difficult. As well as mRNA for spike, you'd simply include mRNA for these internal proteins. And there's two of them in particular that seem to help to induce the protection. And so it wouldn't be technologically a very difficult feat, and I think the regulators would be fast, but perhaps not as fast as 2020, when of course the world was on its knees and they acted with extreme speed.